I remember one particular time driving down to Orlando, Florida, rented out a very crappy hotel. Okay, I'm gonna stop, Mickey. It was a motel. It wasn't a hotel. So anyway, I'm telling people about this story on my stage presence of how a defining moment that I had in my life that really changed everything for me financially. And it was on our drive back from Orlando back to Atlanta. It's a little bit dark. I got a bunch of kids in the back seat sleeping on each other's shoulder. I look over at the passenger seat. I see my wife, and she's falling asleep as well. But there was this one moment, Mickey, that I caught my own eyes in that rearview mirror.
Welcome to D50 After Dark. I'm your host, Mickey Bennett, and in today's episode, we will be again talking to professional speaker Victor Johnson, and we're going to dive deep into storytelling. This is a story you'll definitely want to hear. Welcome back to the show, Victor.
Yes, sir. Happy to be here.
Now, you told me that you are all about telling stories.
I love telling stories.
Yes, I think everybody, whether they realize it or not, loves a good story. It's why we have multi-billion-dollar film industry and book industry. Stories sell.
Yes.
So tell me, why is storytelling important?
As a speaker, storytelling is super important because it helps you connect with the audience, right? If you can find ways to make them feel like it's something they can either relate to or they've been there or just anything that kind of brings that commonality out, it helps them to follow along with whatever your story is about or whatever your topic is about. It helps to make people feel like, oh, I should follow and listen to that person because I can relate to that. So when they hear the story, it also humanizes you as a person instead of you spitting out all these statistics and things about whatever it is that you're speaking about. It also helps people to realize how that information ties back to you personally. So any story that I'm telling or any topic that I'm talking about, I'm going to find a way to at least tell how it impacted me or somebody else that, I was dealing with in those scenarios, depending again on what the topic is. It's always better to find ways to incorporate a story when you're a speaker.
So for you, storytelling is primarily about being relatable with the audience.
Yeah, and connecting and helping them see themselves in the story or in that discussion. If you are talking about, we'll talk about my job. So we're talking about home ownership and what you need to do to become eligible for a mortgage. Well, there was a time where I was not eligible. So if I share with them, hey, I got disciplined, I started really hunkering down on my budgeting and I started paying off debt and things like that. Well, now it makes that person feel like, oh, okay, so this guy's done it. So I should listen to him because he's proven out what he's talking about. So it just is another way to add credibility to what you're speaking on and helps tie that person into, well, he can do it, then I can do it type of thing, at least from my perspective, yes.
Yeah, credibility. I often tell people in Toastmasters that a lot of the things we do in developing our speeches is to make ourselves credible to the audience so that they'll be open to our message. And for you, storytelling is also about conveying credibility.
Credibility and connection, for sure.
Yeah. Well, tell me, how do you choose your stories and how do you adapt them to your audience?
It's important to me to work with that event planner. So if I've been hired to come out and speak to a group of teachers, for example, I have created surveys that I'll send out ahead of time to just get a little bit more understanding about what they're dealing with, maybe a challenge that they have, a goal that they want to accomplish. And I want to incorporate that into my talk. And then I'm going to take it a step further and say, well, have I lived through one of those scenarios? Is there a story that would make sense for this topic and for those teachers when I'm going to speak? So it's doing a little bit of homework in advance. And then it's also finding ways to think about what they're going through on a daily basis and either tell a story of somebody else that can relate to them or find a way to something that I've lived through to help them to relate to that. So again, it is back to that connection piece and it ties back to credibility because I'm able to say, well, here's how it benefited me. Everybody's had a situation like this and it just, yeah, you see the head start nodding and affirming what you're saying, which also helps you feel more confident on stage, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, so we talk in Toastmasters a lot about knowing your audience,
Yes.
and that's what I'm hearing from you now. You talk to the person who brought you to the event to
Yes.
find out as much as you can about the audience, what they're going through, what their challenges are, what they're trying to accomplish, so that you can incorporate that through storytelling into your speech.
Very much so. And I think it's important as a speaker, you're there to give to your audience, not to just showcase yourself, right?
Yeah.
So if you've learned, you've done your homework, you found out from the event planner, what do they want the audience to convey from you as a speaker? And again, you can't just spew data and stuff at people. You got to make them feel like, oh, this is a human behind that microphone. It's not just a bunch of data. And it also, I think, helps you to be more of a common person, so to speak. Like you're not just standing up here all knowing and like you're greater than the audience. No, I'm with you and we're here together and let's go do it together. And the stories help people to feel like, yeah, that's somebody I can roll with. That's somebody I can really relate to with what they're talking about.
So, would you ever give a speech without a story in there somewhere?
Not often. I mean, you don't want to force a story either, right? But most cases, there's something that I could tell you, like, for example, this, that, and then I'll give an example of something. And so I think it's important to tell a story. I probably have spoken before without giving an actual story, but usually that's going to be something that's more of a workshop or something where it's strictly data driven, but I'm always still going to find a way to tie in that story. I just think it's so important to you as a speaker.
And do you only use stories about yourself?
No, I'll do stories about anybody. I tell a famous story about myself. So my wife and I, we blended our families. So I had 3 kids. She had one. We blended these kids together. And I was living in Atlanta, and we often would take these little summer trips. Just my way of being a good dad, trying to force some kind of family activity in the summer months. But there were a couple of summers where my finances really didn't support me being that great dad, right?
Hmm.
And we would take these little road trips. And I remember one particular time driving down to Orlando, Florida, rented out a very crappy hotel. Okay, I'm gonna stop, Mickey. It was a motel. It wasn't a hotel. So anyway, I'm telling people about this story on my stage presence of how a defining moment that I had in my life that really changed everything for me financially. And it was on our drive back from Orlando, back to Atlanta. It's a little bit dark. I got a bunch of kids in the back seat sleeping on each other's shoulder. I look over at the passenger seat. I see my wife, and she's falling asleep as well. But there was this one moment, Mickey, that I caught my own eyes in that rearview mirror. I didn't like the man that reflected back at me in that time. And that was a changing moment for me because when we got home, everybody got settled in, but I stayed up and I put together like a to-do list of things. What do I need to do to become the man that I really want to be? The obstacles I need to clear out, the debts I need to get cleared up, the workouts, the water I need to drink, the books I should be reading. What do I need to do to become the man that I would be happy about looking in that rearview mirror at? So I tell that story a lot of times, and at times it gets emotional. And when people feel that emotion in you, they now want to follow you because they feel like, wow, that's a relatable person. They're just a normal person that went through something. I went through that same type of scenario. Maybe not the same road trip, but having to deal with a true confrontation about their finances or something else that they wanted to overcome in their life to become better. And so I tell that story a lot through my motivational speeches, just so that people feel like, this guy, he's got something and I can relate to him. And I would love to hear more about what he has to say about transitioning his life. So that's an example where a story really helps me with getting people to kind of take action towards becoming the better person that they want to be.
Yeah, I notice your story uses a potentially very powerful image of you looking in the mirror and seeing
Yeah.
yourself,
Yeah.
like literally seeing yourself, but really what it was is you were thinking about who you were at that time. It
Yes.
reminds me of that Michael Jackson song,
The man
right?
in the mirror.
The man in the mirror, which is
Yeah.
which is a very powerful symbolism in that song, very
Yes.
similar to your story.
It is. And that was a defining moment for me that nothing else before that was powerful enough to drive me to change the way that that moment did. And I think that's why storytelling is important.
So, for our listeners who want to incorporate powerful stories into their speeches, first of all, where do they get these stories?
They got to be comfortable being vulnerable, Mickey. Oftentimes, your best stories are going to come from you sharing something that you may not want the world to necessarily know about you. You know, especially in a world of social media where you only post the great highlights of your life. Well, when the camera goes off, there's reality there. So I think being a good storyteller, it has to have a level of vulnerability that allows you to say things about yourself that you normally wouldn't celebrate to the world. But it's the way that people feel like, you know what, if he can say that about himself, then what makes me be any different? Why can't I confront something about it? So I think it's important as a storyteller, you got to dig deep, find the vulnerability, and talk about the things that truly transformed you. If you're a speaker that wants to help people make a transformation, then you got to talk about what transformed you. And again, that may not be your prettiest moment in life. So I think that's a critical step in it. And then two, do the homework, know the audience. I probably wouldn't tell that same story to a bunch of retirees that are trying to figure out where they should invest the $1 million that they have, right? That's not the same story that's going to relate to them. Maybe one of my real estate investing stories would be appropriate for them, like how I was able to invest and turn an almost 300% return on one of my investments. That might be something that they would want to hear more about. So, understanding your audience and being okay with being vulnerable are two of the key takeaways I would say for storytelling.
And any tips for crafting the story itself for impact? How do you put the elements of the story together? Like, do you like start in the middle, or what do you do?
Great question, Mickey. This is where Toastmasters has really helped me because, again, the speech structure, where do I slide this in to make it make sense? Uh, at times, it'll be a beginning. The opening is where the story makes the most impact because now I got everybody's attention. Other times, it may be one of the takeaways that I want you to have where I'm going to say, hey, you know, the number two takeaway is this. Let me tell you about how I applied that in my life. So maybe it makes more sense during that example, or it may make sense at the closing. So let me tell you how it all transformed for me. When I got home, I was able to write down those notes and start taking action. So you got to understand how to apply it in. I don't think there's a rule of thumb, but I think you figure out where does it make most sense. And that's where practicing your speeches really comes in handy. And Toastmasters has really helped me be better about that and to really work on sliding in stories in between and at the beginning or at the end where it makes sense for me.
You know, one thing I always tell people, and what I try to use myself when I'm crafting stories. When I was young, I heard George Lucas talking about storytelling in his famous Star Wars movies.
Okay.
And he said, drama is this: you introduce your characters, you introduce conflict, and then you resolve the conflict. And it's maybe an oversimplification, but it's a really great just kind of guide that I think of when I tell a story. It's like, okay, who are my characters? Did I introduce them by name?
Right.
What's the conflict? Is it clear? Is it powerful? Now resolve it for the payoff.
I can definitely see that making sense. And he's been pretty successful with that format. I don't know that all of my speeches are going to be a protagonist and an antagonist type of scenario, but when it does make sense, I certainly will follow that format.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So storytelling. Let me just check my notes here.
Hmm.
Now, what would you say about storytelling to motivate people?
Mm. Well, it goes back again to understanding who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
What was I brought here to do? What is my work here today?
Yeah.
You know, am I supposed to motivate or am I supposed to be informative? If
Mhm.
my job is to motivate, then I need to know a little bit more about some of the challenges people are dealing with. Why do they need motivation? It helps to have those event planners, that are able to share that with you. Or, as I said, for you to do some type of a query on that group ahead of time. There are times where you just get plopped in on the stage and, hey, there's your group, go to work. And that's where reading your audience, understanding a little bit about yourself, and still, I think in those moments, you got to find, well, where are my jokes at? Where can I make people laugh and get people to kind of get comfortable with me on stage? But as a motivator, I think stories have been a huge benefit for me because, again, my own story is motivational and inspiring. So telling my own stories or people that I've, encountered in my life that have overcome some pretty horrific things and have come out victorious, those are the kind of stories I think that motivational speakers should always be in storytelling mode. I mean, it's how you get people to kind of be influenced by what it is that you have to share.
Yeah, very cool. Well, before we conclude this conversation, do you have any call to action for our listeners?
I do. I want people to visit my website, bethevictor.us. I do speaking, so if you are looking for a motivational speaker or somebody to come in and inspire your audience, I'm your guy. I have all of my video content on the website, so you can visit us there. And I'd be more than happy to coach anybody who's looking to become better on stage at storytelling. So thank you for that opportunity. I appreciate it.
So you provide people with coaching on how to be a better speaker, and you also can be hired to come speak at events.
That is correct.
Very cool. And Victor, VICTOR?
Yes, .us.
.us. Bethevictor.us. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for talking about storytelling with me. And in our next conversation, we're going to be talking with Victor about confidence and charisma. And I think this guy probably knows a thing or two about confidence and charisma. So stay tuned for our next conversation with Victor Johnson.